Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're here, I'm going to assume you've already done the reasonable things. You've turned the lights down low, maybe you've got a blanket, maybe a cup of something warm that you're not really drinking anymore, just holding because the warmth is nice. Good, that's exactly right. Tonight, we're drifting back to Rome, ancient Rome specifically, to one of the most famous deaths in all of recorded human history, an event so thoroughly documented, so obsessively analyzed, so relentlessly dramatized across 2,000 years of art and theater and bad film adaptations that you might think there's nothing left to say. And yet, here we are. Because the story of Julius Caesar, not just his death, but the man himself, the strange circling mythology of his life, the years of chaos that led a group of Roman senators to genuinely believe that stabbing their colleague 23 times in a public theater was the responsible choice. That story has a texture to it that tends to get smoothed away in the dramatic retellings. The Shakespeare version gives you poetry. The Hollywood version gives you swords and slow-motion blood. But what actually happened is somehow both stranger and more mundane. It's a story about a man who was very, very good at one thing, and whose one thing made almost everyone around him quietly, then loudly, then fatally furious. So, get comfortable. We're going to take this slowly. There's no rush tonight. Rome is not going anywhere. Well, actually it is eventually, but not for a few hundred years. Let's start at the beginning. Gaius Julius Caesar was born in Rome in the year 100 BC, which, depending on how you look at it, makes him either a Leo or a Cancer. Ancient historians disagreed. Modern historians disagree about whether ancient historians were even close. We're already 3 sentences in, and the facts are already slipping away from us, which is, frankly, very Roman. What we do know is that Caesar was born into the patrician class, the old aristocracy of Rome, families who traced their lineage back to the city's mythological founders with the kind of breezy confidence that suggests they had never once been asked to actually prove it. Caesar's family, the Julii, claimed descent from Venus herself, via her son Aeneas, via Romulus, via a fairly elaborate chain of semi-divine ancestry that was, let's say, conveniently impossible to disprove. So, Caesar came into the world with a famous name and essentially no money. His family was noble in the way that a crumbling manor house is noble, impressive from a distance, drafty up close, and increasingly difficult to maintain. His father died when Caesar was 15 or 16. His uncle by marriage was Gaius Marius, one of the most powerful military men in Rome, and his aunt was married to Lucius Cornelius Sulla, who was Marius's great enemy, the man who would eventually march his army into Rome itself, which was the kind of thing that was absolutely not supposed to happen, and which Romans reacted to the way you might expect, which is to say with tremendous violence, followed by a sort of exhausted resignation. Caesar grew up, in other words, in a household adjacent to enormous political power during one of the bloodiest periods of Roman internal politics on record, which meant he grew up learning that politics was a matter of survival, not idealism, a lesson he would spend the rest of his life applying with exceptional precision. He was, by most accounts, extraordinarily charming, dark-eyed, lean, with the kind of quiet intensity that makes people feel when he looked at them that they were the only person in the room. He was also famously vain, about his thinning hair specifically, which he combed forward over his forehead and wore in a laurel wreath as often as possible because the Senate had granted him the right to wear one, and he was absolutely not going to waste that perk. He was an excellent speaker. He wrote with clarity and directness that his contemporaries admired, and later generations have described as almost eerily in its modernity. He could ride a horse at full gallop with his hands behind his back, dictating letters to multiple scribes simultaneously because he apparently found regular riding insufficiently stimulating. He was, in short, the most exhausting type of historically significant person, the kind that makes you feel from across 2 millennia vaguely inadequate. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to the young Caesar. broke, connected, ambitious, and about to have a very bad few years. When Sulla marched into Rome and declared himself dictator being at this point in Roman history a legitimate legal title, not yet the shorthand for everything terrible that it would later become, he drew up what were called proscription lists. These were essentially government-sanctioned hit lists, names written on tablets and posted in the forum, after which those named men's property could be seized and they themselves could be killed by anyone who felt like it, with a reward on offer. Caesar's name was not on the list, but Sulla strongly suggested that he divorce his wife, Cornelia, whose father had been Marius's political ally. Caesar refused. This is one of the first moments in the historical record where Caesar's character comes clearly into view, because refusing Sulla was not a casual decision. Sulla had already killed thousands of people. He had the legal apparatus of the Roman state behind him, and a teenager with a famous name and no army looked at all of this and said, essentially, no thank you. Sulla stripped Caesar of his priesthood, his wife's dowry, and his inheritance. Caesar fled Rome. He spent time hiding in the Sabine hills, moving between houses, bribing soldiers when they found him, until eventually his mother's family intervened, and Sulla, perhaps grudgingly, perhaps with the intuition of one powerful man recognizing another, agreed to spare him. The story goes that Sulla, when persuaded to let Caesar go, said something to the effect of, "Have your way, but know that this man you are so eager to save will one day be the ruin of the aristocracy. In this one Caesar there are many Mariuses." Whether Sulla actually said this, or whether later Roman writers added it retroactively to make the story feel more complete, is impossible to know. History has a tendency to furnish
its own prophecies after the fact. But the sentiment, real or invented, is interesting, because Sulla was right in a way that neither he nor Caesar could have fully anticipated. Caesar left Rome for the East. He served in the military, as young aristocrats were expected to do, and distinguished himself immediately. He won the Citip crown at the Siege of Mytilene, a military decoration awarded for saving the life of a Roman citizen in battle, which was a significant honor and which entitled him to wear a wreath of oak leaves and have audiences stand when he entered a room for the rest of his life. He was probably about 20 years old. It was also around this time that Caesar was kidnapped by pirates, which is, and I want to say this as calmly as possible, one of the most structurally perfect anecdotes in ancient history. The Cilician pirates of the eastern Mediterranean were, by the late Roman Republic, a genuine geopolitical problem. They operated out of the rocky coastline of what is now southern Turkey, raided shipping lanes, attacked coastal towns, and had grown powerful enough that Rome was actively embarrassed by its inability to deal with them. They also, as a side business, took wealthy captives for ransom. Caesar was traveling by ship when pirates captured him. They named a ransom of 20 silver talents, which was a substantial sum. Caesar, according to Plutarch, laughed at them. He told them they had no idea who they were dealing with and that the ransom should be 50 talents. He was not negotiating down. He was genuinely insulted that they had valued him so cheaply. The pirates, apparently charmed or simply confused, agreed to this. They sent his companions off to raise the money, and Caesar spent roughly 38 days as a pirate hostage. By all accounts, he was a terrible prisoner. He slept when he wanted to sleep and made the pirates be quiet when he was resting. He wrote poetry and speeches and made the pirates listen to them, and when they didn't applaud sufficiently, he called them illiterate barbarians, which they may well have been, but which is perhaps not the most tactically sound approach when you are being held captive by armed men on a boat. He played games with them. He exercised on deck. He joined their games and their drinking, and with a sort of cheerful condescension, treated them less like captors and more like a slightly rough travel companions. And whenever they annoyed him, which was apparently often, he told them, pleasantly, that once the ransom was paid and he was free, he was going to come back and crucify every single one of them. The pirates thought this was funny. The funny thing about it is that it wasn't a joke. The ransom was paid. Caesar was released. He went immediately to the nearest town with a fleet, raised a small private naval force, sailed back to where the pirates were still anchored, and captured most of them. Then he applied to the regional governor for permission to execute them. The governor, a man named Junius, temporized. The pirates had money.
He was considering selling them into slavery instead, because there was profit in it. Caesar did not wait for the governor's decision. He went back to the pirate camp, and he crucified them. All of them. He did apparently arrange to have their throats cut first, as a mercy, or perhaps as an efficiency. It's not entirely clear, but he crucified them exactly as he had promised, and then moved on with his life. The lesson being perhaps that Caesar meant what he said, or perhaps that even as a young man, he understood that reputation was a form of power, and that a threat unfulfilled was a promise broken to yourself. Either way, the pirates were crucified. Caesar went home. The story remained famous enough that 3 writers recorded it, which for the ancient world is essentially viral. Let's drift forward a little, through the years of early career building, the marriages, the debts, the slow accumulation of influence. By the time Caesar was in his 30s, he had an extraordinary amount of debt and an extraordinary amount of charisma, and he had learned that in Rome, these 2 things could be managed simultaneously if you played them correctly. He had political allies. He had the populares, the faction of Roman politics that positioned itself as the voice of the people, the common citizens, the masses who were not patrician and not wealthy, and who made up the actual majority of Rome's population. He was elected to increasingly significant offices. He served as quaestor, as aedile, the aedile being roughly the person responsible for public buildings, games, and infrastructure, which in Rome essentially meant you were responsible for keeping the urban population entertained and not rioting. Caesar was very good at this. He put on games of spectacular excess, spent money he did not have on gladiatorial displays and public feasts, and made himself enormously popular with the plebeians in the way that politicians in every era have made themselves popular by giving people things they enjoyed and not immediately handing them the bill. He was elected Pontifex Maximus in 63 BC, which was Rome's chief religious office, a role that came with an official residence in the Forum and a great deal of symbolic prestige, and which Caesar won partly through bribes so substantial that he reportedly told his mother on the morning of the election that he would either return as Pontifex Maximus or not return at all, because his debts in the case of defeat would have been unmanageable. He returned as Pontifex Maximus. He was elected praetor. He served as governor of further Spain. He returned from Spain with enough money for the first time in his adult life to begin paying down what he owed. He formed a political alliance with Pompey the Great, Rome's most celebrated military commander, and Crassus, Rome's wealthiest man, a man who became rich largely by buying burning buildings at discount prices, putting the fires out with his private fire brigade, and then selling the properties back at full value. A business model that is entrepreneurial or monstrous, depending on your tolerance for that sort of thing. This alliance, Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, was called the First Triumvirate. It was unofficial, technically illegal, and enormously powerful, and it held together, with varying degrees of tension, for several years. Caesar was elected consul in 54 BC, and then he did something that would define the next decade and ultimately the rest of his life. He went to Gaul. We should pause here to say that Gaul, in Caesar's time, referred roughly to the territory that is now France, Belgium, Switzerland, and parts of Germany, a vast, heavily forested, fractious region populated by dozens of Celtic tribes who were variously allied with, hostile to, or entirely indifferent to Rome, depending on the year and the specific tribe in question. Caesar's governorship gave him command of Roman provinces on the southern and northern fringes of this territory. The province itself was relatively peaceful. What Caesar did, in a move that was, depending on your perspective, either brilliant strategic opportunism or straightforward aggressive expansion, was use a pretext involving migrating tribes and Roman allies requesting assistance to launch a series of military campaigns that eventually brought essentially all of Gaul under Roman control.
This took 8 years. During those 8 years, Caesar fought battles that his own officers described as nearly impossible. He built fortifications of extraordinary engineering in days that should have taken weeks. He bridged the Rhine, which was considered the boundary of the civilized world, in 10 days, marched his army across it to demonstrate Roman power, and then dismantled the bridge when he came back, because he apparently wanted to make clear that he had done it as a choice, not a necessity. He fought the Belgic tribes in the north. He crossed the Channel and invaded Britain twice, not with any lasting result, as it turned out, but with considerable style. He suppressed revolt after revolt. He laid siege to Alesia, the fortified hill town of the Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix, who was the most formidable opponent Caesar faced in Gaul, a man who had actually managed to unite multiple Gallic tribes under a single command, which was historically remarkable, and won. And he wrote about all of it, in clear, spare, third-person prose that is still taught in Latin classes. Caesar narrated his own campaigns with the calm detachment of a man describing a series of perfectly reasonable events. Caesar then moved his forces to the river. The enemy, seeing their position was untenable, withdrew. Caesar, judging the moment correct, ordered the advance. Always Caesar, never I. A style choice that managed to be simultaneously modest and deeply architecturally self-promotional. He sent his dispatches back to Rome. He sent gold. He sent prisoners who were sold as slaves by the thousands. Modern historians estimate that the Gallic Wars resulted in the enslavement of roughly 1 million people, which is one of those facts that tends to sit uncomfortably in the middle of admiring accounts of Caesar's military genius. And while Caesar was in Gaul, winning battles and writing about them, Rome was slowly falling apart. The thing about the late Roman Republic, the thing that sometimes gets lost in the biography of any individual figure, is that it was not a functioning system by Caesar's time. It was a system designed for a city of modest size and roughly equal aristocrats that had been stretched over a Mediterranean empire and several hundred years of escalating inequality without ever being fundamentally redesigned. The Senate was the center of Roman government, technically, but the Senate was largely composed of wealthy men defending their own interests. The assemblies of the people existed, but were increasingly manipulated. The rule of law existed, but could be suspended by sufficiently powerful individuals. Violence in Roman politics, street gangs hired by politicians, armed intimidation at elections, had been a normal feature of public life for decades before Caesar. The Republic, in short, was the kind of institution that everyone officially revered and that was visibly, structurally, unable to govern itself. Into this environment came Caesar, returning from Gaul with a professional army that was intensely loyal to him personally, with a fortune extracted from conquered territory, with a reputation that made him the most famous living Roman, and with a political situation that, while he was away, had developed in a direction that was personally very inconvenient for him. Pompey and Crassus, his partners in the triumvirate, had drifted. Crassus was dead, killed in 53 BC during a catastrophically ill-managed military expedition against the Parthians at a battle called Carrhae, which is sometimes cited as one of the worst defeats in Roman military history, and which Crassus managed to achieve by marching his army into the desert and allowing it to be surrounded and destroyed by a Parthian force that was mostly cavalry and archers, and that simply declined to engage in the sort of close-quarters fighting that Romans were good at. With Crassus gone, the balance of the triumvirate collapsed. Pompey drifted towards the Senate. The Senate, which had always been uncomfortable with Caesar's power and popularity, began making moves. And in 49 BC, the Senate issued Caesar an ultimatum. He must disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen or be declared an enemy of the state. Caesar thought about this for a while. He thought about the length of the Rubicon River specifically, which was a small stream in northern Italy that marked the legal boundary of his province. A Roman general was forbidden by law to cross the Rubicon with his army. To do so was treason. Caesar crossed the Rubicon. He reportedly said as he crossed, "Alea jacta est," the die is cast. Or he said it in Greek, which was the language of educated Romans in private moments, or he was quoting a playwright, or he said nothing at all and it was added later. The historical record, as always, offers options rather than certainty. What is certain is that he crossed, and that when news reached Rome that Caesar was coming with his army, Pompey and the Senate fled the city without really fighting for it, which was, and Caesar seemed to understand this immediately, a political gift of extraordinary value.
Rome had handed itself to him without a battle. The civil war that followed lasted 4 years, moved from Italy to Spain to Greece to Egypt to Africa to Spain again, and ended with Caesar as the uncontested master of the Roman world. Along the way, he met Cleopatra, but that is genuinely a story for another night. By 45 BC, Julius Caesar had done something that the Roman Republic had never quite managed to accommodate in its official ideology. He had won. Not won an election, or won a military campaign, or won a political argument. He had won Rome itself, in the way that Rome had never been won before, and the city was now trying to work out what to do with a man for whom it had no appropriate category. Caesar was appointed dictator, not for the traditional 6-month emergency term, but for 10 years initially, and then in early 44 BC for life. Dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity. He accumulated honors with the methodical efficiency of someone who was either sincerely trying to build a new kind of Roman government or was enjoying himself enormously, or possibly both. He was given the right to wear the full purple toga of a triumphant general at all times. He was given a golden throne in the Senate. His birthday was declared a public holiday. His statue was placed among the ancient kings of Rome. A month was named for him, July, which retained his name to this day. Because when you've conquered most of the known world, you get to keep your name on a calendar month indefinitely. He was also reportedly offered a crown. On the feast of Lupercalia in February of 44 BC, his colleague Mark Antony approached him publicly with a diadem, a royal crown, and offered it to him. Caesar refused, 3 times according to the sources. The crowd cheered each refusal. Whether this was a genuine test of public opinion, Caesar seeing if the Romans were ready to accept a king, or a staged performance of modesty that everyone understood was staged, is one of those questions that historians argue about and that ultimately can't be settled. What's clear is that he crossed, and that when news reached Rome that Caesar was coming with his army, Pompey and the Senate fled the city without really fighting for it, which was, and Caesar seemed to understand this immediately, a political gift of extraordinary value. Rome had handed itself to him without a battle. The civil war that followed lasted 4 years, moved from Italy to Spain to Greece to Egypt to Africa to Spain again, and ended with Caesar as the uncontested master of the Roman world. Along the way, he met Cleopatra, but that is genuinely a story for another night. By 45 BC, Julius Caesar had done something that the Roman Republic had never quite managed to accommodate in its official ideology. He had won. Not won an election, or won a military campaign, or won a political argument. He had won Rome itself, in the way that Rome had never been won before, and the city was now trying to work out what to do with a man for whom it had no appropriate category. Caesar was appointed dictator, not for the traditional 6-month emergency term, but for 10 years initially, and then in early 44 BC for life. Dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity. He accumulated honors with the methodical efficiency of someone who was either sincerely trying to build a new kind of Roman government or was enjoying himself enormously, or possibly both. He was given the right to wear the full purple toga of a triumphant general at all times. He was given a golden throne in the Senate. His birthday was declared a public holiday. His statue was placed among the ancient kings of Rome. A month was named for him, July, which retains his name to this day. Because when you've conquered most of the known world, you get to keep your name on a calendar month indefinitely. He was also reportedly offered a crown. On the feast of Lupercalia in February of 44 BC, his colleague Mark Antony approached him publicly with a diadem, a royal crown, and offered it to him. Caesar refused, 3 times according to the sources. The crowd cheered each refusal. Whether this was a genuine test of public opinion, Caesar seeing if the Romans were ready to accept a king, or a staged performance of modesty that everyone understood was staged, is one of those questions that historians argue about and that ultimately can't be settled. What's clear is that he crossed, and that when news reached Rome that Caesar was coming with his army, Pompey and the Senate fled the city without really fighting for it, which was, and Caesar seemed to understand this immediately, a political gift of extraordinary value.
Rome had handed itself to him without a battle. The civil war that followed lasted 4 years, moved from Italy to Spain to Greece to Egypt to Africa to Spain again, and ended with Caesar as the uncontested master of the Roman world. Along the way, he met Cleopatra, but that is genuinely a story for another night. By 45 BC, Julius Caesar had done something that the group that formed around the idea of assassinating Caesar is usually called the liberatores, the liberators in ancient sources, though Caesar's supporters called them various other things. There were roughly 60 people involved at various levels of planning and commitment, which is, by any operational standard, an extraordinarily large conspiracy. The fact that it stayed secret for as long as it did is either a tribute to the conspirators' discipline or an indication that Caesar, surrounded by admiration and accustomed to being the most important person in every room, had stopped carefully attending to warning signs. The two central figures were Gaius Cassius Longinus and Marcus Junius Brutus. Cassius was the operational mind, sharp, resentful, efficient, with the kind of focused political grievance that makes for either an excellent senator or an excellent plotter, depending on circumstances. Brutus was the moral weight. Brutus was the name that made the whole enterprise look principled rather than merely murderous, because Brutus was known throughout Rome as a man of exceptional personal virtue, serious, philosophically inclined, deeply committed to the idea of the Republic as an institution worth defending. He was also Caesar's friend. This is the part of the story that tends to get amplified in the dramatic retellings: the betrayal, the intimacy, the famous last words. Shakespeare gives us et tu, Brute. Caesar himself, in the surviving historical sources, does not appear to have said this. Suetonius, one of the most detailed ancient biographers of Caesar, says that Caesar pulled his toga over his face when he realized resistance was useless, a gesture of dignified acceptance, or perhaps simply a man who did not want to see the faces of the people killing him. Plutarch says Caesar said something in Greek. Some historians think the Greek phrase was an expression of resignation, kai su teknon, you too, child. Others think this is a later addition. The truth, as with so much of Caesar's last moments, is genuinely uncertain. What we do know is that Brutus conspired to kill him, and that Caesar, right up to the last few weeks of his life, seems to have either trusted Brutus or was unwilling to act on whatever suspicion he felt. There were warnings, a number of them actually, delivered in the weeks before the Ides of March, the 15th of March, 44 BC, with a frequency that, in retrospect, makes you wonder whether Caesar was simply not paying attention or whether there was some part of him that had decided it didn't matter. There was a soothsayer. History remembers him as Spurina, who warned Caesar to beware the Ides of March. This is in multiple sources, including Plutarch and Suetonius, which makes it one of the better attested of the warning stories, though whether the warning was issued before or reconstructed after is the usual caveat. Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, had terrible dreams the night before the assassination. She begged him not to go to the Senate meeting. Caesar was apparently inclined to agree, or at least postpone. He was not feeling well. He had been having episodes of what ancient sources describe as the falling sickness, what we would likely identify today as epilepsy, and the preceding months had not been physically easy. Decimus Brutus, one of the conspirators, a different Brutus, Rome having perhaps an excess of Brutuses for narrative clarity, went to Caesar's house that morning and talked him into coming. He argued that it would look cowardly, that the senators were waiting, that postponing would be embarrassing. Caesar got up, got dressed, and went. He passed Spurina on the way to the theater of Pompey, where the Senate was meeting, the Curia of Pompey, a large hall adjacent to the theater complex. Caesar remarked to the soothsayer, with what Plutarch renders as cheerful dismissal, that the Ides of March had come. Spurina replied that they had, but had not yet gone. Caesar went inside. The meeting had been arranged with some care. The conspirators had positioned themselves around Caesar's seat. The Ides of March meeting was, in the official calendar, one at which Caesar was to receive petitions. Citizens and senators could bring requests directly to him in his capacity as dictator.
A senator named Julius Caesar approached first, presenting a petition for the recall of his exiled brother. He grabbed Caesar's toga. This was the signal. The first cut came from behind, a shallow cut to the neck. Caesar seized the hand of the man who'd cut him. The room collapsed into motion. The conspirators swarmed forward, and in the confusion, 23 men stabbing in a confined space, several of whom reportedly cut each other by accident. Caesar was stabbed 23 times. He fell at the base of a statue of Pompey, his great rival, the man he had defeated in civil war, the man who, once Caesar's partner, had died in Egypt, betrayed by the Egyptian court, who had hoped to curry favor with Caesar, and instead simply sent Caesar the severed head of the man he had once called his friend. Caesar had reportedly wept. Now Caesar died at the base of Pompey's statue, and the conspirators stood around him, some of them bleeding from wounds they had accidentally inflicted on each other. And it became immediately clear that while they had planned the assassination with reasonable competence, they had not made any meaningful plans for what came next. They expected, in a vague and philosophically optimistic way, that the Roman people and the Roman Senate would greet the death of the dictator with relief and gratitude, and the Republic would simply resume, like a patient waking from a fever, like a river returning to its natural course. This did not happen. The senators fled. The conspirators processed through the forum with daggers raised, shouting about liberty and the Republic, and the Roman citizens who witnessed this largely went home and shut their doors. Rome went quiet with the particular silence of a city that is not sure what has just happened and is waiting to find out. Mark Antony, Caesar's lieutenant and co-consul, had been kept out of the Senate House that day. One of the conspirators, a man named Trebonius, had detained him in conversation at the entrance, which was the conspirators' method of ensuring that the most militarily dangerous figure close to Caesar wasn't in the room when it happened. Antony heard the news and, with some understandable urgency, disguised himself as a slave and got out of sight while he tried to work out what Rome was going to do. The conspirators, in the absence of any coherent plan, retreated to the Capitoline Hill, Rome's most sacred location, with a small group of supporters and waited, for what exactly was not entirely clear. Caesar's body was left in the theater of Pompeii for several hours, attended only by 3 slaves who eventually put it in a litter and carried it home. His wife Calpurnia was waiting. The physician who examined the body later determined that of the 23 wounds, only one, a stab to the chest, had been fatal. What followed in the coming days and weeks was the kind of political situation that political theory does not handle gracefully. The removal of a central figure from a system that had been reorganizing itself around that figure for years, without any agreed-upon mechanism for determining what came next. Antony negotiated a fragile truce with the conspirators. There was a meeting of the Senate in the temple of Tellus, the goddess of earth, at which it was agreed that Caesar's acts would be legally valid and the conspirators would receive amnesty, a diplomatic settlement, a carefully balanced nothing. And then Caesar's will was read. Caesar's will left his gardens to the Roman people as public parkland. It left each Roman citizen 300 sesterces, not a fortune, but not nothing. It named his great-nephew Gaius Octavius, an 18-year-old studying quietly in Apollonia, as his adopted son and primary heir. And then Caesar's body was carried to the forum for his funeral. Mark Antony gave the eulogy. The content of the eulogy is debated, whether Antony actually displayed Caesar's blood-stained toga, holding it up so the crowd could see the cuts, whether he read the will aloud in its entirety, whether the emotional temperature of the crowd built slowly or quickly. What is agreed is that by the time the eulogy was complete, the crowd in the forum had left the planned ceremony and were building a spontaneous pyre from whatever came to hand. Benches, chairs, offerings, and they cremated Caesar in the forum itself, which was emphatically not where Caesar was supposed to be cremated, but which Rome's emotional temperature at that moment was not interested in correcting. The conspirators left Rome. Cassius and Brutus retreated to the east, rallying forces. Antony consolidated his position in the west, and then Octavian, young, quiet, not yet 18 when he learned his uncle had been killed, traveling back to Rome from Apollonia with a small entourage, arrived and began doing something that no one had anticipated. He started winning. But that, truly, is its own story. The story of how a teenage boy named Octavian spent the next 14 years outmaneuvering Antony, Cleopatra, the Senate, the conspiracy's remnants, and the general chaos of late Republican Rome to become Augustus Caesar, the first Roman emperor, and to give his name to a month of his own, and to die, very old, of natural causes in his bed, which was the kind of ending that nobody in his stories seemed to manage. That story deserves its own quiet night. For now, let's let Caesar rest. 23 wounds, a golden throne, a month, a comet which appeared in the sky shortly after his death and which Romans called the Cetus Iulium, the Julian star, and which they understood with the generous interpretation that we tend to give to the recently powerful as Caesar's soul ascending to the heavens, because of course they did. A temple was eventually built in the Forum on the spot where he had been cremated. For centuries afterward, Romans left flowers there. He was 61 years old. Let's drift forward now, or perhaps sideways is more accurate, to another corner of the ancient world. Because if Rome's story of concentrated power and its human cost feels familiar, if the machinery of ambition and the fragility of political arrangements feels like something you've seen before, then perhaps it's useful to remember that this was not a Roman invention. These patterns are older than Rome. They are, in some ways, as old as the first person who decided that what they wanted most was to be the only one making decisions.